All right, thank you for joining today. Our topic for today is going to be Salesforce as the IDP. It has two types, SAML and OpenID Connect. Then we're going to talk about delegated authentication. And finally, Identity Connect. We'll do the quiz on Sunday. If you're not able to attend on Sunday, I'll publish the quiz. So you'll be able to do it self-paced at that time. And so feel free to interrupt me anytime you like. I'm definitely studying and learning along with you guys. So if you see anything that looks questionable, please let me know because I might have misunderstood the topic. The Salesforce as identity provider. So Salesforce itself can function as the entity provider for either other Salesforce orgs or for really any application that can access the internet. And so if you've built something that's a web-based application, mobile, or anything built on Salesforce platform itself, you can use another Salesforce org as the IDP. From a licensing perspective, every user that has a full CRM license also gets an identity-only license, and then they get access to all of the identity features. Beyond that, all Salesforce orgs get complimentary 100 identity-only licenses. And so if your company is smaller and you want to be able to use Salesforce for your IDP for other applications, but those users don't need CRM, you don't have to worry about getting those licenses. It comes included. There is a nifty little add-on where these identity-only licenses include 10 custom objects, but it's a contractual limitation. It's not enforced on the org. If you go over that and Salesforce does an audit, then you'll be going through contract negotiations. But before that, you can do 10 custom objects, and then the identity features that is going to include single sign-on, MFA, identity verification, and all the other things we've been talking about so far. That's the overview. And then there are two ways to enable it. And so you can either enable Salesforce as a SAML identity provider. In that scenario, you're going to be using the my domain name from that org as your issuer URL, and you're going to get the certificate from that org as well. You're able to manage what users have access to what service providers by creating multiple connected apps. And so if you have multiple applications, whether it's in the company or other external apps, you can connect to them that way. And it's going to enforce the policies from that IDP org. And so it will also let you enable MFA and all the other features as well. The second way to enable it is OpenID Connect. This one is also going to use a connected app, but it's going to use a little bit different setup, and we're going to go through that in a little bit, that you can do for each service provider. The key about OpenID Connect is whatever application you're connecting to has to be able to accept OpenID Connect tokens. Otherwise, the second method doesn't work at all, which kind of makes sense. So let's talk about implementing Salesforce as SAML identity provider. And so this one is going to work a lot like the demo that we looked at last week, where you're going to gather your information from your service provider because you need to know their identity ID, which is going to be a URL, their ACS, in case you're using an experience site or something that's a subdomain under that URL. And then you're going to enable on your identity provider org the setting for identity provider. You'll set up a connected app for each service provider. You need to make sure that you remember to grant users access to those connected apps, because I forgot that step when I was doing the demo. And then those users can go ahead and log in. After you've done all of that, then you go to the service provider org, and on that side, you'll set up the SSO SAML on that side. So any questions before I start demoing it? So for this one, we're going to use, I have two developer orgs set up. One is my IDP org, and the other one is my service provider org. And then I'll also show you some of the steps that we have available for troubleshooting. So let's start with IDP org. And so when you go to setup, you're going to go to identity provider. And I've already done this in my org, but I wanted to show you where to find it. When you go here, the only thing you can do after you enable it is you can change the certificate that it's using. And if you create a new certificate, it lets you create one and associate it. And then I always encourage people to use the larger size key because that's going to last 2 years instead of 1 year, and you don't have to worry about as much maintenance. back. I can disable this right now, and when I disable it, it just hides everything, and I'll do that so you see it. Are you sure you want to disable it? Yes. And this is the way yours is going to look like if you haven't enabled this in your org. So when you first come to it, it's a pretty empty page. When I re-enable it, it still asks me what certificate I want to use, and I'll keep the one that I had set up already. And my issuer domain name does not change because this is my domain name from this org. I can get it either from here or under my domain name. It's still tied to the same certificate. And then this URL is also consistent. So I'll be able to use this URL to set up this on the service provider in a little bit. From here, my next step is to set up my connected app. So here, I think this is going to take me to launching a new one. I want to show you the one that already exists. So when you go to App Manager, these are all your connected apps. And this is everything in the system. It's going to be anything you have for your org, do you have an app launcher, or any other connected apps that you've built as well. And so here I have one named as descriptively as I could. This is my Salesforce or ADP Connect. Let me go into View. And so this is the same screen as when you go to create one. And so here, I'm going to be entering the information I have from my service provider. And so you'll see that this is going to break because this is not a full domain name. So we'll fix it in a little bit. Let me hit edit so you can see what that looks like. And so you, just like usual, you name your connected app, you add an email address on it. You're going to enable SAML. And when you enable SAML, you get a lot more options that show up here. And like I said, these are truncated, so we'll fix those. You can select your subject type. It can either be a username, federated ID, user ID, custom attribute, or persistent ID. The thing to note about username is, if you guys remember, all Salesforce orgs, regardless of environment, require you to have unique usernames. And so whether you're in a sandbox or in production, or if you're a member of multiple production orgs, username must be unique. So usually you're going to be using something like federated ID or a custom attribute, because those are going to be more flexible for you. Username will only work if you're not connecting to another Salesforce org. And then here, usually you have your format just like you have on the SP side, and all these things have to match. So here's my issue ID. It's my domain name for this org. And actually, let me go back to identity provider. So here, when you set up your identity provider, the certificate that's tied to this is your default one. But let's say you wanted to use a different one from one service provider versus another, you're able to change that here. So here it's going to use my default one, but if I had multiple certs, I can pick a different one. I can request whether things are going to be signed or encrypted, and then I can also set my algorithm for how the key is going to be passed through. And this is everything you have to set up for the connected app for the service provider. Everything else on this page is not related to the service provider. Questions on that? Save. Then when I go to manage, this is where I want to make sure that I'm going to be adding either profiles or permission sets for the users that are able to use this connected app from the IDP org to get logged on to the service provider org. So let me go to users. And you'll notice this connected app is pretty basic. You don't have to worry about setting anything else up for going to edit policies. You don't have to worry about scopes because there is no scope. Everything is SML, SAML, sorry. You're not having to do anything with OAuth because none of that is required for this connected app. It's a pretty basic one. So now let's go to the service provider org. And I'm going to put them side by side. case we need to update anything. And so just like last time, under single sign-on, you're able to, it's already enabled. SAML is enabled because I tested Axiom last week. And now I have my IDP here. And so here, the most important thing I can tell you is everything that you have here must match here. So we already know that our URLs are wrong. So let's go ahead and edit that to fix that. And so here's my entity ID. In this scenario, the ACS is the same. In a community site, it could be different. And I'm making sure my issue URL here is the same as what I have here. And I'm making sure that HTTPS, because that's best practice. It doesn't have to be, but that is best practice. And then everything else should be matching. So now I'm going to hit save. And so one thing to note here, if I were to do high assurance session required here on this connected app, that's going to enforce MFA on the IDP org. Anywhere where you see high insurance, going to request MFA. If I select user provisioning here, it would sync my users between both orgs. Right now, I have not played with that. So right now I'm going to leave it blank. But let me look at one more thing there. We'll do that another time. So now in theory, it should work. The other thing that I want to show you is over here on the identity provider, we have this SAML metadata discovery endpoint. If you give this to your other application, so I'll copy this and we'll make like I don't have this one already. If I go to new from metadata URL and I create it, it populates everything for me automatically. It's coming from the IDP. It makes my life much easier because I don't have to worry about having to enter everything and duplicating it. So, but if I hit save right now, it's going to give me an error because if you remember, your issuer and your entity have to be unique. And so the combination is unique. If you have that duplicated, it's going to give me an error and say you cannot proceed. I'll hit cancel. If I did not have this IDP already in my remote site settings, I would get an error saying that it's required to add this domain name to remote site settings. The only place where you get that is from creating a configuration from the metadata URL. If you start new or if you start from metadata file, it does not give you that error. And so now, let me see if I have everything set up correctly. I'm going to log out here. And I do not have everything set up correctly. And I can tell because I can't choose my service provider here. So let me see. There we go. But I only have Axiom. So I still don't have the other one that I'm expecting to have. So let's log back in and see why I don't see that. I keep forgetting to turn off MFA on this org. So that was a direct login into the service provider. I didn't use any IDPs. Let's go see what I forgot. So after you've added a new single sign-on option, you need to make sure you enable it on your page here. And since I hadn't enabled it, it was not showing up. And now it's here, and I'll save it. Now let's log back out. And because I have Authenticator set up with this org, with this username, it wants me to do Lightning login, but I don't want to do that. So and when I go here and say login with the SFS IDP SSO, this is saying go use that single sign-on IDP. And so you'll see that something is not set up properly, and we'll be able to troubleshoot it together. It happened very quickly. Did you guys see the domain name change? it went from service provider to IDP and then bounced back again. So let me see. So here's service provider. Let's see if you'll see it flash very quickly. It goes to IDP and immediately to service provider. So let's see if we can figure out what I did wrong. So I have the identity provider event log here. And today I have 2 successes here. So something is happening wrong when I redirect back into the service provider because it's not matching. So let's see if I have you guys played with the troubleshooting part of SAML?
You showed us that in the last session, Marlene, so that's what I remember. And
Okay.
then I tried to do the same by myself.
Yeah. So I'm going to see if this shows me my last error, and it does. So this one, what it's saying is unable to map subject to Salesforce user. And so it will remember the last error that you had in SAML as long as everything else connected properly. So let's see. Users. It doesn't tell me which user, but and the problem is probably the user I'm logging in with. So I'm logging in. Nope, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4. I have a test user as well. And my test user doesn't have the federated ID on it. So let's see. Oops. You guys still see my screen? The incognito window?
Yes, incognito window.
Sure. Then let me go back here. And this time I want to log in with my test user, which I don't have here. And so I'm trying to log into my IDP with my SP user, which is incorrect, right? Because this user doesn't exist here. Here I just have the federated ID. So I'm going to go back to IP user. But I know I'm going to get an error, but let's do it anyway. And so I have something wrong in the middle. I'm not going to take too much more time talking about this because I have a lot more content to go through. But you can see that when you're working with a service provider and identity provider, you need to go really get familiar with your SAML validator to see what's wrong. I'll figure out what I did after our call, and then I'll just probably put it on the session information, and then I'll make it part of the quiz. So let me close this and go back to. So the way that I would troubleshoot this, I would start comparing my settings between my identity provider, my service provider, and see where I'm going wrong, because something is wrong. And so it's not finding the user I'm expecting to find, even though it's got the test user, my user here has the same federal ID as this one. It should be working. So I'll figure it out and see what happened to it.
So Malin,
Yeah.
just a quick check on the flow, right? So
Yep.
you will be on the you will hit the service provider URL first, right? And when you click on the login with service provider,
Mhm.
it should redirect to the identity provider URL where you will
Mhm.
going to put the identity provider username password, and then you will log in back to service provider or whatever the matching user you have in the service
Mhm.
provider, right? That's
Yeah,
the right.
that's correct. And what happened to us, let me refresh this page, see if we see anything different here. Okay. I don't know what that. And so because I was already logged on to the IDP with a valid session, the first time I did it, it went straight to the error page because what happened is exactly what you said. Service provider redirected to IDP. IDP checked, is this person already logged in? Yes, so don't ask them for the credentials again and send them back to the service providers with the SAML assertion. Something is happening there where it's not finding me back in the service provider application because the error is actually on that side. Because here I can see the IDP, it's saying it's a success, so everything's fine here. There's something wrong on the other side.
Understood. So TSA approved the check, but our flight is say that okay. You may not
Exactly.
enter the plane.
Somebody changed their boarding passes after they went through TSA. But yeah,
Perfect.
and so
Thank
something
you.
is off there. But yeah, thank you. All right, so let's keep going back to our presentation because I've got lots more to cover. Take these back over here. And so this is the fun part about when you're learning this part of the identity. I definitely recommend you set up the two orgs because I've had this happen before and I go through and I find the error just to figure out what was causing the issue. Sometimes I had the wrong endpoints. Sometimes I forgot, like I said, to add the user to the connected app. So that way, even though everything was fine, it would say this user doesn't have access. So it would give me that error. Or sometimes it wouldn't be able to resolve back to the service provider because I'm getting successes today on IDP. I know a problem is on the other side. What's our next topic? So our next topic is still Salesforce's IDP, but this time with OpenID Connect instead of the SAML setup. This is a little bit different. It does not require you to enable the org as identity provider. What you do is you create a connected app. And in the connected app, you're going to set the scope to be OpenID. You're going to configure the ID token, and then you set how long that token lasts. And it will go from 1 minute to 720 minutes, which is 12 hours, which I thought was strange. I figured it would go to 24 hours, but it did not. You get to set up your ID token audiences to see how that's going to work. And if you have any additional secondary attributes to your token, do you want to send the user's information along with the token, like their username, profile, phone, and address? Or do you only want to send their token as yes, true, false, they're authenticated? You can also include custom attributes and custom permissions. If you add a custom permissions, and this is a little mistake that I'll take out of my presentation. Custom attributes do not require this additional scope, only custom permissions, and you can see the scope itself is custom permission. So I'll update the presentation because this is incorrect. And then you're going to provide all this information to your service provider who probably has some application they need to update to connect to the connected app endpoint, provide the client in the secret to be able to consume that. And so most of what you do on this side is very straightforward configuration. The bulk of the work here is on the service provider to get that set up. So let me give you that demo as well. And I'm going to go back to my IDP. I'll go back to App Manager. I'm going to create a new connected app. And then here, you're going to select Enable Auth. Until you do this, you don't see what you're expecting to see. When you enable auth settings, you need to provide a callback URL, which is going to be the URL of your service provider. For now, I'm just going to do a fake one. And then I need to select the correct scopes. At minimum, it's OpenID Connect. What was interesting to me in studying this is it requires OpenID or the custom permissions. It does not require this identity URL service, which to me seems like it would be exactly what you would need, but it's not. It's OpenID or custom permissions. Custom permissions right above it. And this one is not required, only OpenID is required. And then when you scroll down here, you have configure ID token. And again, you need to select this to see the other options that you need to configure for this token. Here's where you're going to set the life of your token and then anything additional related to it. This is going to be very much in working with your service provider to see what they need to get from you. And then here's where if you want to include the username, phone, and so on. Custom attributes doesn't require anything, as you can see here in the help text. And if you include custom permissions, it tells you right here that it requires that scope. If you miss that and you don't add it, when you save it, it gives you an error. And so it gives you the warning first that you have to wait 10 minutes, and then it tells you custom permissions require the custom permissions scope. This is as far as I got with playing with this because I don't have a service provider who would be able to consume this OpenID Connect token. But I wanted to get you familiar with the UI side of where you go and you do this. This would be easily done by an admin. It does not require any development on the ID side. Questions? If you've ever worked with connected apps, it really does take 10 minutes for things to take into effect. So if you're troubleshooting things, it can be challenging because you've got to make one change at a time, wait 10 minutes, and then test it before you move on. So I've had to do that before. It's kind of fun. So that's OpenID Connect. I left it pretty light because I haven't played with the other side on service provider. If I have time, I'll try to, but I think for the certification, it's just being aware that Salesforce's IDP does support OpenID Connect. It requires a service provider to accept OpenID Connect tokens. And all you really need to do on your side is to set up a connected app. Delegated authentication. Finally understand what the difference is between delegated authentication and federated authentication. So let's go through those. So it is similar, but one of the things that is really fundamental to it is it hands over control over passwords to an external authentication method. From that point forward, when you enable delegated authentication for specific users, those users' passwords are no longer stored in Salesforce. That other provider method is going to take care of everything for you, and it's going to apply any password policies on their side, however they need to. And at that point, that user can only log in through that method. They cannot reset their password. They cannot put in a password into Salesforce and have it work. Basically, that Salesforce functionality stops working altogether. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is the user does stay on Salesforce login page. They enter their credentials on Salesforce. Then Salesforce is going to pass that information to a web service. That information is both the username and the password. And if you're starting from Salesforce login at salesforce.com, it's going to be passing through a clear text password. There are ways to tokenize that, but not if you start from salesforce.com. Like I said, a user or an admin cannot reset their own passwords. And I think I have an example of what that looks like for you from the user side. I was able to try to reset my password, but I was not able to complete the whole process. Federated authentication is used in conjunction with LDAP or Active Directory, or if the service provider does not support SAML. The web service tends to be SOAP. And from a SOAP service perspective, you should download the WSDL from Salesforce. SOAP is case sensitive, so you want to make sure that you provide that WSDL to your developers to build that web service to make sure that everything works correctly. So let's look at the flow because it's a little bit different, and I walked through a little bit. So here, the login is displayed. The user enters their credentials. Salesforce is going to check the profile or permission set to see if single sign-on is true. If it's true, then Salesforce is going to call that web service. If it's false, then Salesforce enforces the standard password policies that we're already used to. This is the delegated flow, so then it goes to the web service. At this point, Salesforce received that password, but because it's single sign-on, it doesn't store it. It doesn't log it, it doesn't view it. It basically throws it away. This information is going to go to the web service. It only is going to send username, password, and source IP. So you can't use federated ID or any other custom attributes if you're using this particular method, because Salesforce is only sending these three particular components. The web service is going to take that information. It's going to go to the credential system to verify if the person is valid or not, maybe LDAP, Active Directory. It might be an on-premise implementation of something like Okta or Ping Federate, because those can function a little bit different. If it's valid, then it goes into Salesforce. You log into Salesforce, you're all set. If it's false, then you're going to go back into Salesforce. It's going to display an error and have the person start all over again. So that's the delegated authenticated flow. And as you can see from a federated authentication versus delegated authentication, it's very different because Salesforce stays involved to collect the credentials, but then after that, it hands everything back off Salesforce onto the external provider. So implementing delegated authentication. So there, once upon a time, you used to have to open a case to do this, but you don't have to do it anymore. Now you can go on to setup. You can enable, disable login with Salesforce credentials on the SSO settings page. You're going to need to build a web service. So that's going to be your IT team that's going to get that set up. Like I said, you need to download the WSDL to build the SOAP service, and you need to be able to make that service available to Salesforce. Usually, companies, if they're using this, there's some sort of application that stores the credentials within their internal network, and they are going to host this web service on the DMZ, which is going to be available to the internet. It is considered a best practice to whitelist the Salesforce IPs to only have access to this DMZ and not to open it to the whole internet. Once you have done that and you get back the web service URL from your IT department or whomever's building it, you're going to go back to setup and you're going to specify that URL on the SSO settings page. The last thing you're going to do is you're going to enable the permissions on the profile or permission set. The permission is called is single sign-on. Once that has been enabled on a user, now they can only sign in with delegated authentication and they cannot use any other method. Those are the steps. And let me see. Now let's do a demo. Let me go to my service provider org again. And so go back to single sign-on. And so here's delegated authentication. And like I said, this used to require a case, but it no longer does. When I go to edit, I enable this and I save it. And after I save it, I have a couple new options. Let me turn that back off again because I want to show you one thing on the user side. When you're ready to enable this on a user, the permission is single sign-on is not available unless you've enabled delegated authentication. And so when I go to custom profile, and I'm looking for is single sign-on, it does not find it. It's not anywhere. I'm just doing a quick search for it. And it's just not here. When I go back and I re-enable delegated authentication, I'll refresh my profile page. And this is true for permission sets as well. Now, is single sign-on enabled is available as permission to add to profiles or permission sets. Now let's go back to a single sign-on. So now I've enabled it and permission is available. I'll go into edit. And then here I have the URL that I would be able to add from the team that builds the service. If you want them to always go to the URL, even when they're outside of IP ranges, you can check this. It's considered best practice to not check it, because if you do, it causes a user to always have to go through this path, and it can slow them down. But if there's some reason that you need to do it because security requires it, it's available here as a feature. So save. I don't remember who I assigned it to. Looks like I did not build it on here. We'll create a quick permissions set. Enable it. And now I'm going to assign it to a test user. Do not assign it to yourself. That'd be a bad idea. I've heard of people doing this and they lock themselves out from their dev org. And I think I did that too fast. I'm not actually saying it. That's my test user. I'm going to enter here, and I'm actually going to enter just any password because it doesn't matter. And I'll do login. And it's going to fail because it's not hitting a real web service. Because I just did test.com. But it's not telling me my password was wrong because I put in a junk password. It's telling me that my service is down. It's not able to reach it, so it's never sending it. So now I'm going to log in with a real one so we can go look at that test user. So now when I go to test user, we're going to see a couple of things. In login history, is today. It should have failed. So there's delegated authentication error history. And so this is what I should be seeing on the login page. So I'll figure out why that's not showing that. But here, because my service is fake and it doesn't have anywhere to go, it's telling me that it timed out. What's interesting about this page is it only shows you 21 delegated errors, and that's it. And so I thought that was kind of an odd number. It's not a number of days, it's just 21 of them. And so this will show you if anything happened wrong with it. Go back to test user. I'm going to reset this password. And here as an admin, I get password not reset for single sign-on user. So it's not even available for me to send in a password. And let me see if I still have. So earlier today, I tried to reset my own password as this user. I was able to go here. I was able to go to forget password, put in my username, get the email to say reset your password. When I click on the password, I got this error. And so it says passwords cannot be reset for single sign-on users. But as a user, my experience was I did a whole bunch of things to reset my password. And then finally, I was told I couldn't do it. I expected to see it when I click on forgot password, but it actually goes through the whole cycle. So your users will see this. They may not know what single sign-on users means, but your admin or IT department can say, oh, that means that you're delegated user and you can't log in directly into Salesforce. You can't reset your password directly. We have to do it on our other system. Questions?
So if we if we have a delegated authentication enabled, right? So user can still get email. Is that right? Or
correct? Because I got my email address is real, right? And so when I did a reset password, it came to this address and it said no. It gave me the link, but the link when I clicked on it would not work.
yes, because it will because of the delegated authentication, right?
Yep.
Makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And this one, because I set up the user and I logged in before I set it up as delegated authentication, it looks, I have a password that I created, but if you have a user that gets provisioned by another process and they're set up to be a single sign-on, their last password change will be blank. And so that's what I have in my org, because our users can't log in directly to Salesforce. They have to use another mechanism. It's not delegated, but it's something else. And so their passwords are blank. Let's go to the last topic, Identity Connect. And this one, I thought was a small topic because when you go to the help pages for this topic, it has one very short overview page, and then it has a couple of pages for how to upgrade from one version to another. But when you go to the document of how to implement it, the document is 132 pages. It's actually a very involved topic. And again, I understand why I missed those questions in the beginning, and now I know so much more. So let's talk about what Identity Connect is. So as an overview, it's an add-on. You don't get any freebies. It is paid and you have to contact Salesforce to get that enabled. It does require my domain name to be enabled, and it can be used for both user provisioning and deprovisioning. It supports AD groups only. It does not support LDAP. And it's used to assign users to their profiles, roles, permission sets, and groups. It does not support permission set licenses. And those have been out now for a few years. So I don't know that Salesforce is ever going to invest to update that. So permission set licenses, you would still need to provision directly on the Salesforce org and not through Identity Connect. It is the best practice to have a dedicated integration user for this process. If it's consuming too many APIs, if it gets locked out or anything else along with it, it's much easier to troubleshoot it if it's dedicated. It does support the Salesforce mobile app, and it also supports SAML SSO integration. It does not support OpenID Connect SSO integration. So let's look at the components because it has things that we're not used to working with. So you can have one or many Salesforce orgs, and OpenID Connect is going to be installed on an on-premise server. So it's not in the cloud. And that's why you need your integration user, because there'll be a connection to go into the actual org. Identity Connect uses Active Directory to see what users need to be created. And Active Directory uses groups. So depending on what groups you have people in, they might be added to one org or another, or maybe both. And then the authentication also happens on Identity Connect, and you'll see that in a little bit. So to keep in mind, this is a paid product It's hosted on premise, and it requires a couple of components. It's going to require the server to be hosted by the company. It has, and you have to download, it's software that you're actually purchasing. So you're going to download the software, install it on the server, and then configure it. Have you worked with anything like this before, Identity Connect?
Yes, I did use the Identity Connect in one of my previous lives. I just want to point out that Salesforce is retiring this feature. If I
Oh, they are. When is it being retired?
it's sometime this year, 2023.
Ah, I wonder if it's still on the exam. Do you know?
That's a good question. I just shared the link about that in the chat.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And so one of the questions might be, how long is it supported? Because I
Right.
think they're up to release 7.1. So that's interesting. Okay. So we'll go through some of the stuff a little bit faster. Hopefully it's not too big a topic for our certification. Implementation steps, there's actually quite a few of them, and you've done this before, but you have to obviously purchase the licenses. Salesforce support has to enable the feature. You need to create a integration user, and these are in the order sequence that you need to do them in. You set up the connected app with the OAuth scope enabled. And after you've done that, you're going to install the managed package. What's interesting is the user that's installing the package has to have the Identity Connect 3 permission set before they can actually do a successful install. So this order really matters just for the very first part of what you're doing for setting up Identity Connect. Then, like I said, on-premise, you're going to download, install, and start the application on your on-premise servers. It supports Unix, Unix-like, and Windows systems. It's going to you're going to configure the connections between Identity Connect, Active Directory, and Salesforce. And you can use AD groups to map to profiles, roles, permission sets, and groups, and you can map multiple AD groups to each one of these. So this is how you end up doing user provisioning and deprovisioning. Then you're going to be doing asynchronization between Active Directory and Salesforce. The recommended approach is to run the reconciliation report first, which is going to give you two groups. One is the will sync group, and the other one is other users. They recommend that you go through that report and clean it up before you actually do the first sync. Once you've done the first sync, it creates a link between Salesforce and the AD group, and it's much harder to fix it. So you may need to run this report multiple times before you do the sync, just to make sure it's as easy as possible. Once you've done that, you're going to configure both live updates, and that's what's going to run on a real-time basis. And also, they recommend that you do a scheduled update once a day in case anything happened for the live updates. That is going to catch it up, and that's for production. And so the actual process is a little bit different, right? So you're going to access the login page. I actually don't know what that option looks like on the login page because I have never set it up. Is it another option at the bottom of the page that you can select to log in, or how does that look like? Do you know?
So we had a different URL itself.
Okay.
And we're pointing to that URL. Yeah. I was not
Okay.
part of the original setup.
Okay.
So yeah, I didn't know some information.
Okay. And so it was probably the URL for the user interface because that is the URL for the Identity Connect application once you've installed it. And that's this interface URL. On this page, you enter your credentials. That's going to validate the credentials against Active Directory. If it's valid, just like the standard SAML flow, then we go into the standard one. It creates the SAML assertion. It signs it. It sends it to the Salesforce, which is now the service provider. The service provider is going to validate the assertion, and then if it's true, it allows access. Otherwise, it's going to fail. So from here forward, it's a standard SAML flow. They do say that you need to use federated ID as a subject type. You should not use the AD user or email or other things.
I just want to add here real quick that the experience was little unusual because let's say I just share the URL, Salesforce URL to someone, right? And if they are not logged in, it's not going, the request was just failing. So I am, for example, I am the URL, and if you are not logged into Salesforce, if you click on that, it will not redirect you to the Salesforce SSO page. You have to first just do the single sign-on, and then you have to click on the link. Then you'll be redirected to the that link, whatever account record, opportunity record, or something like
Oh,
that.
wow.
So
Yeah, that's kind of
that's also
clunky.
painful. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'll definitely read the link you sent me for end of life because I think I missed that when I was going through this. So I'll add it to the information. And then I'm curious to see how much, it's probably maybe one question on the exam. There's so much where Salesforce can be set up as the identity provider with the SAML, OpenID, or just the regular standard way that I think it's like 20% of the exam. So it's a good chunk of it.
No, I agree. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, that's everything I had for today. Like I said, I didn't get a chance to create the quiz. I have 24 questions on these topics, and I'll go through. I think I only had 3 for Entity Connect because there was so much more on the other topics that were more detailed that made sense to me to have there. I know I've heard from somebody that delegated authentication is not used very frequently, so I would expect there won't be many questions there either, but we'll see. Do you have any questions or any other comments?
No, no other question for now. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm going to stop